Hello again, Psych 370 students, and welcome to another video lecture. In my last video lecture, I talked about something called evaluative conditioning, right? Which is where you basically try to change how someone feels about something. So you try to change how somebody evaluates something, like a product, by pairing it with something else that the person already evaluates positively or negatively. And so the way that evaluative conditioning is used or can be used in advertising is you take your product, you pair it with something that most people probably already like catchy music, humor, an attractive person, a popular celebrity, or whatever. And the goal is that people will come to like your product more because they'll associate it with this other thing that they also like. That's how evaluative conditioning works. But of course, not all applications of classical conditioning involve trying to get people to like something more, right? So, for example, take problems like drug addiction and paraphilias, what we call paraphilias, which are basically abnormal sexual desires. In those cases, the problem is essentially that the person likes something too much, right? Or at least more than they should, more than they wish they did. But classical conditioning can be applied to those problems too. So I'll talk about the application to drug addiction first. And guys, the first thing that I want to say about this is that classical conditioning does seem to be a contributing factor when it comes to many of the phenomena that characterize drug addiction. Now, if you've already read the article that you're going to be doing your next article summary on, then you should have some idea of what I'm talking about here. After all, a drug, like heroin, is an unconditioned stimulus, right? You don't have to learn anything for that drug to exert its effects. And the unconditioned response to heroin is, among other things, the high, the euphoria that the user experiences when they take the drug. So, if the drug gets paired repeatedly with certain stimuli, like the paraphernalia, a particular setting, a certain person, or whatever, then those stimuli can become conditioned stimuli, and they may come to elicit conditioned responses that oppose, that compensate for the effects of the drug. And what that means, of course, is that if a user continues taking the drug in a particular place, in a particular way, or with particular people, then they're probably going to wind up needing to take more and more of that drug in order to achieve the original high. So the user is going to have to increase the dosage that they take in order to increase their unconditioned response to the drug so that it overpowers these compensatory conditioned responses that they've acquired. So, in other words, the acquisition of those compensatory conditioned responses can at least partially explain drug tolerance. And again, this is clear from the results of the article that you've read or that you will read for your next article summary, where rats who received heroin in a novel setting experienced greater mortality rates than those who received it in the same setting where they had undergone previous heroin injections. So, classical conditioning can account for certain aspects of tolerance, and withdrawal symptoms can also be understood in terms of these compensatory conditioned responses that drug users can be expected to acquire. So, after all, those compensatory responses oppose the effects of the drug, right? So, if the user stops taking the drug, then they're going to experience those compensatory responses all by themselves. So instead of the high, instead of the euphoria that the drug produces, the user will only experience aversive symptoms like anxiety and discomfort. Now, withdrawal symptoms are typically quite the opposite of what the user experiences in response to the drug, so it makes sense to view those withdrawal symptoms as compensatory conditioned responses that are just no longer being offset and overpowered by the user's unconditioned response to the drug. So, at least until those conditioned responses get extinguished, we can expect the user to experience withdrawal symptoms. And finally, classical conditioning may also play a role in relapse. So, for example, suppose that a heroin user enters a 28-day rehabilitation program. Okay, so they stop using, they get clean. But then, after they leave rehab, they return to the same environment where they used to abuse the drug. Well, it's likely that that environment, that setting, is going to contain many stimuli that the user associates with heroin, right? So, when they encounter those stimuli, they're likely to experience discomfort. Those stimuli are likely to elicit cravings and other conditioned responses, other withdrawal symptoms. And so, I think you can see how that could motivate the user to go back to using the drug again, if for no other reason than to counteract those unpleasant conditioned responses. So, the point is, classical conditioning clearly seems to be involved in all these aspects of drug addiction. It can help us understand things like tolerance, withdrawal, and relapse, especially if we invoke that compensatory response theory that we covered last week. But it's also possible to treat drug addiction using methods that are very much based on classical conditioning. For example, one way to do that is to use a technique called aversion therapy. And this is actually very similar to the counter conditioning technique that I talked about in the context of phobia treatment. The difference is that instead of trying to get rid of an unpleasant response to a stimulus, like a fearful response to rabbits, with aversion therapy, you're trying to get the client to acquire an unpleasant response to a stimulus so that they stop engaging in a harmful behavior. That's the idea. So, for example, this diagram illustrates how aversion therapy can be used to treat alcoholism. So, what you do is you allow the alcoholic to drink their favorite drink, but you add a drug to it that causes nausea. And drugs that do that, by the way, are called emetics. Okay, we call those drugs emetics. So, you pair the alcoholic beverage with an emetic, right? In other words, you treat the beverage like it's the conditioned stimulus. You treat the emetic like it's the unconditioned stimulus. And of course, the idea is that the alcoholic will learn to associate the taste of the drink with the emetic so that their originally pleasurable response to the drink will get replaced by a nauseating response to it. So that's what I meant earlier when I said that aversion therapy is all about getting the person to acquire an unpleasant response to a stimulus so that they'll avoid it, so that they'll acquire an aversion to that stimulus. And so after enough of these pairings, the drink alone will be enough to elicit nausea. And at that point, obviously, the person will no longer have the desire to consume it. Now, a similar technique, which is also a form of aversion therapy, is to put the alcoholic on a drug called antabuse, which basically interferes with the metabolism of alcohol. So, the way that antabuse works is if somebody who has taken antabuse then goes out and consumes alcohol, the result is that they don't metabolize that alcohol the way they normally would. Instead, they get a buildup of this toxic substance called acetaldehyde, and guys, that acetaldehyde accumulation causes illness, makes you feel nauseated. So again, the idea here is similar. People who are taking antabuse, well, first of all, they tend not to drink in the first place because they know it'll make them sick. But if they do drink, then they'll experience nausea shortly afterward. And so they'll come to associate the alcohol with the nausea, and that unpleasant conditioned response to alcohol should motivate them to avoid alcohol in the future. Okay, so aversion therapy is an application of classical conditioning that can be used to treat drug addiction, but it can also be used to treat what we call paraphilias, which, as I said before, are basically perverse, inappropriate, abnormal sexual desires and behaviors. If you want a more technical definition of a paraphilia, then I've given you an excerpt here on the slide of how the DSM describes paraphilias. But the word paraphilia literally means, in Greek, incorrect love. Okay. And so some of the more common paraphilias, some of the more common incorrect loves out there include pedophilia, where the person is sexually attracted to children, masochism, where the person derives sexual pleasure from being subjected to pain or humiliation, and exhibitionism, where the person enjoys displaying their genitals to other people. Several other examples of paraphilias are also listed here and described in your textbook, such as sadism, transvestism, fetishism, and voyeurism. And the textbook does discuss the possibility that these paraphilias may result from classical conditioning. So, for example, in the case of masochism, maybe the person just so happened to experience pairings of painful stimuli, right, with other stimuli that elicit sexual pleasure. So now they associate pain with pleasure. So that could be where some paraphilias come from. It's an interesting idea. But again, like I talked about in my video lecture on phobia treatment, regardless of whether these paraphilias really do have their actual origin in classical conditioning, which in at least some cases is debatable, people who suffer from paraphilias can still benefit from treatments like aversion therapy that are based on classical conditioning. For example, pages 106 and 107 of your textbook describe a case of a man whose transvestism was successfully treated by pairing images of himself in women's clothing with an emetic drug. So as a result, he lost his interest in cross-dressing. And pedophiles are sometimes given pairings of photographs or visualizations of naked children with such aversive stimuli as electric shocks or foul odors. In fact, though, aversion therapy seems to be especially effective in pedophilia if the images of naked children are paired with a relevant social consequence of sexual contact with children. So, for example, if the pedophile sees or imagines a naked child and then imagines something like being ridiculed by others or being arrested, then that can make the therapy even more effective than it would have been if something less socially relevant, like a shock or a foul odor, had been used as the US instead. But anyway, in any event, I hope that you see the similarity here between the use of aversion therapy to treat drug addiction and the use of it to treat these problematic sexual desires, these paraphilias. In both cases, we're using classical conditioning to get the client to acquire an unpleasant conditioned response to something that in the past had elicited quite pleasant responses for them. And again, the goal, the reason that you're doing that is so that the person acquires an aversion to that thing, to that drug, to those images, or to whatever the case may be. Now, aversion therapy is effective. I mean, if an alcoholic gets pairings of a drink with an emetic, then they are likely to avoid alcohol, at least in the short run. And if a pedophile gets pairings of child pornography with electric shocks or social ridicule, then they're likely to become less sexually aroused by children. So this technique does work. But one weakness of aversion therapy, which might have already occurred to you, is that extinction can occur. After all, once the treatment has ended, once an alcoholic has completed their last aversion therapy session, they know that they can go to any bar now, right, and have a drink that isn't spiked with an emetic. Just like a pedophile knows that they can, in the privacy of their own home, look at pictures of naked kids without having those pictures be followed by shocks or by ridicule. So, in other words, it's possible for people whose problems have been treated via aversion therapy to then expose themselves to the conditioned stimulus, like the alcohol, without also exposing themselves to the unconditioned stimulus, like the emetic and the nausea that follows it. And if they do that, of course, it can lead to the extinction of the conditioned response that the aversion therapy was designed to instill. So, for example, after enough sips of alcohol that aren't followed by nausea, alcohol can stop eliciting that nausea for the alcoholic. So, even though aversion therapy is often quite effective, its benefits are sometimes temporary because of this extinction problem. Now, that problem can be overcome with so-called booster sessions where the client returns to therapy for additional pairings of the drugs or the images with the aversive stimuli. But of course, participating in those booster sessions does require an ongoing commitment from the client. And even though most clients who undergo aversion therapy have volunteered for it, it's obviously an unpleasant experience. And so it's really not all that surprising that the dropout rate is fairly high and that clients are often unwilling to return for booster sessions or to refill their anti-abuse prescriptions or whatever. But still, the point is, for those who are willing to endure it and to commit to it, aversion therapy can be an effective form of treatment for problems like addictions and paraphilias. And despite the fact that it's generally unpleasant for the client, it is often preferable to the alternatives, which might include things like prison time or even castration. Okay, well, that's all I have to say about this application of classical conditioning. So I'm going to stop this video lecture here. And I have one more video lecture planned for you for this week, in which I'll be talking about a phenomenon called conditioned taste aversion and how it can be applied in the real world too. So make sure that you check out that video lecture when you get a chance. As always, I hope you'll let me know if you have questions about any of this stuff, and I hope you have a great day. Take care, guys.